The nurse was hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state. One day, the Blake mansion stood at the top of a hill, surrounded by tall cypress trees that seemed to be the silent guardians of a secret buried in time. The building, although imposing, did not convey the splendor of its classical architecture. On the contrary, there was something gloomy about those corridors, as if the walls carried a mourning that silence could not hide. It was there that Esther Morgan, a young and determined nurse, disembarked to begin a job that would change not only her life, but that of everyone around her. Esther arrived on a cloudy morning, the grey sky reflecting the oppression she felt as soon as her feet touched the property's stone entrance. The front door opened before she could even knock, revealing a tall woman with a rigid posture, wearing an impeccable black dress that seemed to absorb the dim light in the room. Michelle Blake, the millionaire's wife, didn't smile. Her gaze was cold, analyzing Esther from top to bottom as if she wanted to measure her competence by her appearance alone. She wasn't hostile, but there was a weight to her presence that made Esther unconsciously adjust her posture. "Are you the nurse?" asked Michelle bluntly. Her voice was low, almost monotone, but there was something there, a veiled pain that she masked perfectly. Esther nodded, trying to look confident, although the atmosphere was already beginning to affect her. "I'm Esther Morgan. I've come to look after Mr. Blake." Michelle only made a brief gesture, indicating that Esther should follow her. As they walked through the mansion, Esther noticed the details. Everything there seemed frozen in time. Antique but impeccably clean furniture, pictures of bucolic landscapes, and a huge staircase that seemed to lead to a world apart. Despite all the wealth, the place lacked life. The only thing that broke the silence was the distant sound of a dog's paws running around upstairs. When they reached John Blake's room, Esther felt a chill. The room was large but austere. In the center, a fitted hospital bed contrasted with the surrounding luxury. John Blake lay motionless, with machines around him monitoring his vital signs. He was a strong-looking man, or at least he had been once. Now his face was pale, with a calm but empty countenance. His hand rested on the sheet, inert. Michelle stood beside the bed, but didn't look at her husband. It was as if she couldn't bear to face the man she had once loved. "He had an accident 6 months ago," Michelle began, her voice almost indifferent. "The doctors say there's not much we can do apart from keeping him comfortable, but that doesn't mean he doesn't get the best possible care. That's why you're here." Esther nodded again, but her mind was already working. She moved closer to John, watching the monitors, his slow breathing, the regular rhythm of his heart. It was a challenging picture, but Esther was known for her persistence. Before she could say anything, Michelle interrupted her. "Don't get your hopes up," she said dryly. "He's not going to wake up, and any movement you may notice means nothing. They're just reflexes." Esther wanted to reply, but decided to keep quiet. There was something in Michelle's tone that sounded more like a warning than an opinion. It was as if she was trying to protect herself from a bigger disappointment than she was already carrying. After a brief conversation about the daily procedures, Michelle left the room and Esther was finally alone with John. She pulled up a chair to sit beside the bed and began to talk, something she did with all her patients, even the unconscious ones. She introduced herself warmly, explaining that she was there to help him, even though she didn't know if he could hear. His eyes fell on the framed photo next to the bed. John was smiling next to Michelle and a golden Labrador, probably Baxter, whose presence had already been announced by the sound of his paws. It was an image that seemed to belong to another world, a life that now seemed distant. Throughout the day, Esther got to know the other servants in the house. The housekeeper, Donna Hilda, was a middle-aged woman who spoke little but watched everything with attentive eyes. The gardener, Raoul, seemed more relaxed, but there was a melancholy in the tone of his voice when he talked about the days before the accident. "Mr. Blake was a good man," he commented as he pruned a bush. "He always treated everyone with respect. It's a shame what happened." But when Esther tried to ask more about the accident, Raoul looked away and changed the subject. In the evening, when Esther retired to her assigned room, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had heard and seen that first day. There was something strange about that mansion, a sadness that seemed to go beyond John's state of health. And Michelle, she was an enigma in her own right. Esther wondered what was behind that icy stare, that forced indifference. Before falling asleep, one last question echoed in her mind. What had really happened that fateful night? In the darkness of the corridor, the sound of Baxter's pause echoed again, but this time it sounded different, slower, almost hesitant. Esther felt a chill when she heard the noise stop right in front of her bedroom door. For a moment, it was completely silent. Then a light scratching on the wood broke the stillness. She hesitated, holding her breath, but when she opened the door there was nothing there. The corridor was empty. The next morning came with a delicate golden glow coming through the heavy curtains of John's room. Esther had been up for hours. Ever since she had taken over the care of the millionaire, she had felt the responsibility of always being alert, as if every moment could hold an opportunity for something new to happen. That morning, she decided to introduce one of her strategies for bringing more life into the silent room: music. Esther brought in a small portable radio and, after setting up the room, played a selection of classical music that she had chosen herself. The melody of a soft piano filled the air, dancing through the furniture and reaching the bed where John lay. As she tidied the sheets and monitored his vital signs, Esther noticed how the music seemed to give the room a new texture. It was as if, for a moment, the oppression of the room had given way to a more welcoming energy. She talked to him as she worked, telling him little stories about her life and describing the sunny day outside. "The sky is clear today, John. The kind of day that should have been made for a walk with Baxter, don't you think?" Esther smiled at him, even without getting an answer. She believed in the power of connection, even if it was one way, and every word she said seemed to carry a bit of hope. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Hilda appeared in the room with a cup of coffee for Esther. The housekeeper seemed more relaxed that day, and when she saw the nurse tidying the room with music playing in the background, she allowed herself a brief smile. "You're changing the air in here," she commented. Esther, surprised by the warm tone, returned the smile. "I think a little lightness never hurt anyone. Maybe he'll pick up on this energy somehow." Hilda didn't reply, but her gaze revealed a trace of approval before she quietly left. Shortly afterwards, Baxter the Labrador came through the open door, as if attracted by the melody that continued to fill the room. The dog stopped for a moment, watching Esther as if studying her, before walking slowly over to John's bed. Esther stopped what she was doing and watched in silence, curious to see the dog's reaction. Baxter rested his front paws on the side of the bed and rested his head on John's side, letting out a soft sigh. It was such a genuine gesture of loyalty that Esther felt her heart squeeze. "You miss him too, don't you?" Esther said softly, reaching up to stroke Baxter's head. The dog stood there motionless, as if trying to convey something that words couldn't express. "Maybe you can help me," Esther continued, almost as a request. And at that moment, as she stroked Baxter, she swore she saw a slight tremor in John's hand. It wasn't a great movement, but enough to make Esther's heart race. She watched carefully, trying to determine whether it was real or just an illusion caused by her own desire to believe. Determined not to overlook any detail, Esther made careful notes of what had happened. Although she was still uncertain, she felt a wave of renewed hope. What if there was something else behind John's apparent inertia? Something that the machines couldn't measure, but which was there, just waiting for the right stimulus. She knew she couldn't jump to conclusions, but she also didn't want to ignore the little signs that seemed to appear when she least expected them. Later, Michelle entered the room, bringing with her the same aura of reserved elegance that had accompanied her since her first meeting with Esther. When she saw Baxter lying next to John, she hesitated for a moment, as if the scene had taken her by surprise. "He used to do that before the accident," commented Michelle, breaking the silence. "Baxter never left John alone when he was ill. It's as if he knew he needed company." Her voice had a note of softness that Esther hadn't heard before. Esther took advantage of the opening to share her theory. "Animals have a special connection with us. Sometimes they notice things that we humans overlook. Maybe Baxter is helping in ways we can't yet understand." Michelle was silent for a moment, watching her husband and the dog. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of longing and guilt, that Esther picked up on immediately. He's a good man," said Michelle, quickly correcting herself. "Always so generous. He didn't deserve to go through that." Esther realized her vulnerability in that instant and decided not to press her. Instead, she responded with empathy. "And there's still a lot of good in him. Sometimes we just need a little more time to see it manifest itself." The rest of the day was quiet, but full of small moments that seemed to herald a subtle change. Baxter stayed by John's side for much of the afternoon, and Esther adjusted her routine to include the dog in her daily sessions. She knew it would be a long road, but she also felt that every step, no matter how small, was an advance towards what seemed to be a forgotten possibility. At the end of the day, as Esther reviewed her notes, she felt a slight satisfaction. It wasn't just the possibility of John's progress that excited her, but also the gradual transformation she saw in Michelle. There was something in the small interactions that suggested that the millionaire's wife was beginning to open a crack in her emotional barrier. Perhaps Esther's presence, or even Baxter's, was helping to soften the rigidity of the house. Esther went to her room with a sense of accomplishment. She knew that the work had only just begun, but she also felt that the seeds of something greater had been planted that day. There was hope, albeit timid, growing in that environment, and she was determined to nurture that flame until it could illuminate the lives of everyone there. Esther was sitting in the small office she had been assigned inside the Blake mansion. It was a discreet but well-lit room, with a large window overlooking the impeccably tended gardens. On the desk in front of her, books on alternative medicine, holistic therapies, and rehabilitation were stacked, accompanied by handwritten notes, open notebooks, and even clippings from articles Esther had collected throughout her career. Despite her experience as a nurse, she knew that John's case required more than conventional protocols. He needed something that would bring not just comfort, but a spark of life to that still, silent body. That morning, Esther dedicated herself to studying music therapy. She researched how different types of sounds could impact the brain and provoke emotional and sensory responses, even in patients in deep states of unconsciousness. Music wasn't just a melody, it was memory, emotion, and sometimes even physical stimulation. He may not react immediately, but perhaps his mind is more active than we think, Esther murmured to herself, while making detailed notes on the studies she was reading. Determined, Esther decided to take the next step. After breakfast, she went to John's room with a small portable speaker in hand. Baxter, the loyal Labrador, was already waiting for her at the door, as if he knew that his presence was an essential part of the process. Esther laughed briefly when she saw him there. "Looks like you know exactly what we're doing, doesn't it, boy?" Baxter wagged his tail and followed her to John's side of the bed. Esther started slowly. She selected soft instrumental music, with piano and violin sounds, and adjusted the volume so that it was just a whisper in the room. The melody seemed to embrace the room, filling the empty corners with something new, something alive. As the music played, Esther watched John carefully, looking for any change, any sign, however small, that might indicate a reaction. For a moment, everything seemed the same. But then something caught her eye. The muscles in John's face, previously completely relaxed, seemed to tense up for an instant. It was such a brief movement that Esther almost thought she had imagined it. "Was that real?" she whispered, leaning in for a closer look. The music continued, and as she adjusted the sheets around John, she noticed that his eyelids fluttered slightly. It wasn't a constant movement, but it was there. Esther felt a wave of emotion invade her chest. It was a start. Throughout the day, Esther decided to expand the sensory stimuli to complement the music. In her work bag, she had brought small bottles of essential oils, each carefully chosen for their therapeutic benefits. Lavender to relax, peppermint to stimulate the senses, and citrus fruits such as sweet orange to bring a feeling of energy and lightness. Esther knew that smell was one of the most powerful senses, capable of evoking memories and emotions, even in seemingly inactive states. Using a portable diffuser, Esther started with lavender. The subtle scent spread through the room, creating an immediate contrast with the usual clinical smell of medical equipment. As she adjusted the diffuser, she spoke softly to John, as she did in all her sessions. "I know you may not be able to hear me, John, but I believe your body can. That smell is calming, something that can help relieve any tension that's in there." She watched carefully as he spoke, looking for changes, however imperceptible. Once again, she saw John's fingers move slightly, almost like an involuntary response. Esther didn't stop there. That afternoon, she decided to try something even more personal. She talked to Donna, Hilda, and Michelle about objects and memories that might have emotional value for John. Hilda suggested a photo album that was kept in the library, while Michelle hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Esther sensed her wife's reluctance, but knew that every contribution could make a difference. "There's a painting he loved in the office," A painting of a lake that we used to visit when he had free time. Maybe it will calm him down too, said Michelle, her tone charged with an emotion she couldn't disguise. When Esther brought the photo album and the painting into the room, the atmosphere seemed different, more personal, closer to something that belonged in John's life. She opened the album on the table next to the bed and flipped through the pages carefully. Photographs of John smiling at events, walking with Baxter, and hugging Michelle in lighter moments filled the pages. Each image seemed to tell a story, a piece of a life that was now suspended. Esther picked up one of the photos and held it close to John, describing what she saw. Here you are at the lake with Baxter. It looks like a sunny day. You looked very happy. As he continued to describe the images, something curious happened. John's breathing, always regular and monotonous, became slightly deeper. Esther noticed the change immediately and paused to observe. It was subtle, but evident. He was responding in some way to the environment she was creating. This filled her with renewed determination. Perhaps it wasn't just a question of looking after John's body, but of touching his mind and spirit too. Baxter, as always, was present, sensing the mood of the room. He approached the bed and, without being asked, laid his head on John's lap, letting out a soft sigh. Esther watched carefully. Baxter seemed like a silent guardian, a living link to John's past. At an unexpected moment, as Baxter stood there, Esther noticed something she couldn't ignore. John's fingers moved slightly as if trying to reach the dog. It was almost imperceptible, but Esther knew it wasn't her imagination. He was trying. At dinner that evening, Esther reported the small progress to Michelle. Today his breathing changed during the song, and his fingers— I swear I saw a movement when Baxter was next to him. Michelle listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the glass of wine in her hand. Finally, she answered, but her tone was cautious. They're just reflexes, Esther. The brain reacts in ways that don't mean anything consciously. Don't get your hopes up where there's no reason to. Esther didn't let Michelle's words get her down. Instead, she responded firmly but gently. I understand your concern, Michelle, but these little signs are important. I'm not saying that he'll wake up tomorrow, or that there will be a miracle, but I do believe that any reaction, no matter how small, deserves our attention. We can't underestimate the power of positive stimuli. Michelle hesitated before answering, and Esther realized that behind that cold facade, there was a woman who also wanted to believe. Do what you think is best, Esther. I just don't want to get my hopes up. It's been 6 months of disappointment. Her voice betrayed some of the pain she was trying to hide. Esther just nodded, determined to carry on with her work. Over the next few days, Esther integrated aromatherapy and music therapy into her daily care sessions. She also started using tactile stimuli, such as massages on John's hands and feet, believing that touch could help rekindle dormant neurological connections. Each session was carefully planned, with attention to detail and a relentless focus on creating an environment of comfort and stimulation. Small signs began to appear more frequently. Subtle movements in the hands, almost imperceptible changes in facial expression, and even a slight tilt of the head during one of the music sessions. Esther documented everything, keeping a detailed record to track progress. She knew that skeptics would say they were just involuntary reflexes, but in her heart, she believed there was more going on there. The relationship between Esther and Michelle also began to change. Michelle, although still reluctant, began to observe the sessions from afar, as if she wanted to understand what was going on. She never said much, but her presence was noticed by Esther, who interpreted it as a sign that Michelle was beginning to open up to the possibility of hope. At the end of each day, Esther felt a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment. Every little bit of progress filled her with energy to carry on, even though she knew the road was still long. But for her, the work wasn't just about recovering John. It was about bringing life back to that house, to the hearts that lived there. The day began with a calm atmosphere in the Blake mansion. The sun's rays streamed through the large windows of the living room, casting soft shadows on the polished floor. Esther, as usual, had been in John's room since the early hours of the morning. Her routine included the basic care and therapies she had been developing over the last few days. That morning, however, she had something different in mind. With a heart full of hope and a certain expectation, Esther decided it was time to involve Baxter more actively in the therapy sessions. The dog, with his constant presence and obvious affection for John, seemed like a link between the millionaire's vibrant past and silent present. She believed that Baxter could be the key to awakening something dormant in John, and she was determined to try. Baxter was used to following her around the house, but until then, his participation in the therapies had been more passive, limited to his comforting presence in the room. Esther, however, felt that the deep bond between the dog and John could bring more meaningful answers. After a quick consultation with Mrs. Hilda to confirm that Baxter was clean and in good condition, Esther called the dog over with a smile. "Come on, boy. Today you're going to help your friend even more." When Esther entered the room with Baxter, she noticed that the atmosphere seemed to take on a different energy. The dog, as always, showed his gentle and intuitive nature, approaching John's bed with careful steps, almost as if he knew the fragility of the moment. Esther stroked the Labrador's head before encouraging him to climb onto the bed. "You can do it, Baxter. Come here, close to him." At first, Baxter stood beside the bed, watching John intently. Esther guided him gently, pointing to the side of the bed as she spoke in an encouraging voice. "Get up here, boy. Stay close to him." The dog hesitated for a moment, looking at Esther as if seeking final permission, before obeying and climbing up nimbly. He carefully settled down next to John, holding his head high. Esther felt her heart race. The room was completely silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the machines monitoring John's vital signs. She slowly approached and put her hand on Baxter's shoulder, leaning over to whisper in his ear, "Now say something to him, Baxter. Show him you're here." She gestured slightly, encouraging the dog to bark. With a single firm bark, Baxter broke the silence, filling the room with a vibration that seemed almost palpable. Esther watched John intently, waiting for any reaction. Nothing happened in the first few seconds, but she knew she needed patience. Calmly, she continued talking to Baxter. "Now lie down, boy. Stay with him." Baxter, as if he understood perfectly, bent down and rested his head on John's lap. It was a gesture so full of loyalty and love that Esther felt a lump in her throat. She kept her eyes on John, looking for signs of any change. Then it happened. John's fingers, which had been motionless on the sheet, moved almost imperceptibly. Esther held her breath, leaning over to take a closer look. Baxter, still with his head in John's lap, remained completely still, as if he sensed that something important was happening. John's fingers moved again, this time a little more firmly. "Is this real?" Esther whispered to herself, her voice full of emotion. Before she could fully process the moment, she noticed another change. John's breathing became slightly deeper, as if he was trying to pull in air more consciously. Esther felt a wave of warmth wash over her, a mixture of surprise and joy. But the most remarkable moment was yet to come. As Esther approached to check John's vital signs, she saw something that left her speechless. A single tear trickled from the corner of his eye, sliding slowly down to the pillow. Esther put her hand to her mouth, unable to contain her emotion. "John," she whispered, feeling that this small gesture meant much more than any camera could record. Just then, Mrs. Hilda appeared in the doorway, attracted by Baxter's bark. Seeing Esther kneeling beside the bed, her eyes watering and Baxter still on John's lap, Hilda hesitated. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Esther turned to her, still thrilled. "He moved, Hilda. His fingers—" and there was a tear. The housekeeper's eyes widened as she slowly approached the bed. She didn't say anything, but her gaze conveyed a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Shortly afterwards, Michelle was called into the room. Esther, although still emotional, reported what had happened with the same professional calm she always maintained. Michelle, however, seemed more skeptical. "A tear?" "Esther, it could just be an involuntary reaction. We can't jump to conclusions." Esther knew that Michelle had reason to be so cautious. She had suffered too much in recent months and was probably afraid of raising hopes only to see them crumble again. Even so, Esther responded gently. "I understand your concern, Michelle, but I believe we should celebrate every little bit of progress. It can be more significant than it seems." Michelle looked at John for a long moment in silence. Baxter remained motionless next to him, as if he too was waiting for something. Finally, Michelle sighed. "You can continue with your therapies, Esther. Do what you think is best." Esther nodded, feeling even more motivated. That moment with Baxter was not only a sign of progress for John, but also a reminder of the power of emotional connections. She knew the road would be long, but now she had more reason to believe she was heading in the right direction. The morning at the Blake mansion began with Esther reorganizing her thoughts as she prepared the day's agenda. Over the last few days, Baxter's presence had brought a breath of hope to John's room, but she knew she needed to go further. Every little progress John made, like the subtle movement of his fingers or the unexpected tear, fueled her conviction that he was somehow trying to communicate. Esther had a bold idea, but she knew it would take a lot of determination to convince Michelle to support it. At breakfast, Michelle was sitting in the large dining room, distracted by the papers in her hands. Although she tried to maintain her facade of coolness, Esther noticed a trace of weariness on her face, as if the last few weeks of therapy had made her lower her defenses a little. Esther seized the moment. "Michelle, can I talk to you about an idea I've had?" Esther's voice was firm but gentle. Michelle looked at her hesitantly but nodded. "I've been thinking. We spend a lot of time looking after John indoors, but I think that maybe the outdoors can help him even more. Places that mean something to him, that can trigger memories and emotions." Esther took a deep breath before continuing. "I'd like to take him to the park he used to go to with Baxter." Michelle was silent for a few moments, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in front of her. Esther could see the internal battle she was fighting. On the one hand, the idea seemed absurd. John was in a vegetative state, and taking him outside the safety of the mansion was a risk Michelle didn't want to take. On the other, perhaps there was a spark of curiosity or a desire to believe that Esther could be right. "Esther, do you know what you're asking?" Michelle finally broke the silence, her voice laden with concern. "John is vulnerable. What if something goes wrong? What if this doesn't bring any results?" Esther leaned in slightly, looking Michelle firmly in the eye. "I understand your concerns, Michelle, but every little change we've seen is proof that he's still here somehow. And I believe that connecting John with something he loved can make an even bigger difference. It's not just about physical progress, but emotional progress too." Michelle pressed her lips together, clearly torn. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh. "All right, Esther, but I want this to be done as carefully as possible. If anything happens—" Her voice faltered, but Esther understood what she couldn't say. The following afternoon, Esther prepared everything with meticulous attention. A specially adapted vehicle was hired to transport John safely, and she organized a team to make sure everything went according to plan. Michelle, although reluctant, would accompany the nurse and Baxter to the park. Mrs. Hilda, with discreetly moved eyes, handed Esther a blanket that, according to her, John used to use on his walks outdoors. When the moment arrived, the mansion seemed to hang in the balance, as if even the servants were watching the little procession with curiosity and hope. Baxter climbed into the vehicle with enthusiasm, while Michelle remained silent, her hands restlessly in her lap. Esther, however, was focused. The journey to the park was peaceful, but fraught with emotional tension. When they arrived, the place seemed enveloped in a special aura. It was a sunny afternoon, but the heat was tempered by a gentle breeze. The trees in the park formed natural arches, and the distant sound of children playing and birds singing filled the atmosphere. It was the kind of day that seemed tailor-made for moments of renewal. Esther carefully arranged John's position in a shaded area, near a wooden bench where he used to sit with Baxter. Michelle remained standing at a distance, watching in silence. Baxter, on the other hand, immediately ran around as if he recognized the place and wanted to share his energy with everyone there. "John," Esther began, her voice soft and full of affection, "we're in the park, the place where you and Baxter spent so much time. I know you must remember it somehow. The fresh air, the sound of the birds. It's all here waiting for you." As Esther spoke, Baxter returned, sitting down next to John and putting his head in his lap, just as he had done in the mansion. Esther noticed that John's breathing seemed a little deeper, as if he was responding to his surroundings. And then something unexpected happened. A melody began to fill the air. It was the soft sound of a piano coming from a nearby kiosk. Esther and Michelle exchanged surprised glances, but it was Michelle who remained motionless, as if she had been hit by a wave of emotion. "That song," Michelle whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Esther leaned slightly towards her. "It was our wedding song," Michelle added, her eyes beginning to water. Esther turned her attention back to John. The music continued, a delicate melody that seemed to carry entire memories in its notes. Michelle approached slowly, as if drawn by a greater force. And that's when Esther saw it. John's lips trembled slightly, almost as if he were trying to form words. His head moved in a subtle but perceptible way, and before Esther could react, tears began to trickle from the corners of John's eyes. It was an unmistakable response, something that couldn't just be attributed to automatic reflexes. Michelle put her hands to her mouth in surprise and emotion. Esther, next to her, whispered, "He remembers, somehow he remembers." Baxter, as if realizing the intensity of the moment, remained motionless, his eyes fixed on John. The music continued in the background, and the park, in all its serenity, seemed to be the scene of a rebirth. Michelle knelt down beside John, holding his hand carefully. "John, my love, I'm here." Her voice broke at the end, charged with emotion. Although he couldn't respond, the connection between them was palpable. The journey back to the Blake mansion was silent, but charged with deep emotions. Michelle, sitting next to John, held his hand with an almost reverent care, as if she were rediscovering a love she had thought lost. Esther, in the front seat, looked through the rearview mirror at the two of them, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. The moment in the park had been a victory, but it had also brought to light emotional wounds that still needed to be healed. Baxter, lying at John's feet, looked tired but satisfied, as if he understood the importance of what they had experienced. When they arrived at the mansion, the atmosphere was different. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hilda, who normally kept a neutral expression, watched the group enter with curious and even hopeful eyes. The employees, who had been living in the monotony of a joyless routine for months, seemed to sense that something had changed. Michelle helped Esther put John to bed, still in silence, but her gestures were more careful, almost affectionate. Once everything was organized, Michelle finally spoke, her voice a little shaky but firm. "Thank you, Esther, for not giving up, for believing, even when I couldn't." There was something in her tone that Esther had never heard before. Vulnerability. Esther felt the weight of those words. "Michelle, it wasn't just for him. It was for all of us. John isn't just a patient. He's the center of this house, and I believe he's still trying to get back to us." Michelle looked away, as if Esther's words had hit a very deep place in her soul. That night, Esther was in her small bedroom when she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Michelle, her face partially illuminated by the light from the corridor. Esther invited her in, surprised by the unexpected visit. Michelle seemed different, less rigid, as if the experience in the park had begun to dissolve the armor she wore to protect herself. "I needed to talk to you, Esther," Michelle began, taking a seat in a nearby chair. She folded her hands in her lap, hesitating before continuing. "What you did today, it reminded me of a lot of things, and it also made me realize how much I failed him before the accident." Her voice broke slightly, and Esther remained silent, giving Michelle room to continue. "John and we drifted apart before all this happened," Michelle confessed, her voice breaking. "He was always such a good man, so dedicated to his work, to his family. But over time I began to feel invisible, as if nothing I did was enough, and instead of talking to him, I closed myself off. I created a barrier between us." Michelle stopped, looking at the floor, as a tear ran down her cheek. Esther felt the weight of that confession and responded gently. "Michelle, we all make mistakes, especially when we're hurt. The important thing is that you're here now, by his side, doing your best to get him back to us." Michelle shook her head, still struggling with her guilt. "But does he know that? Does he know how much I love him? What if I never get the chance to tell him? Esther, I don't know if I can live with this." Esther, who had remained so professional and restrained until that moment, felt the need to share something personal, something that could show Michelle that she wasn't alone in her regrets. "Michelle, I understand what you're feeling, more than you know." Michelle looked up, surprised by Esther's tone. "Before I worked here, I looked after another patient. She was a young woman, full of life, but who had suffered a terrible accident. I did everything I could to help her, but she didn't survive. And to this day I wonder if I could have done something different, something more." Esther paused, her voice becoming softer. "That loss is what led me to dedicate my life to patients in critical situations. Every time I see a little progress in John, I feel like I'm helping not only him, but also that young woman I didn't have the chance to save." Michelle looked at Esther, her expression full of empathy and something else. Gratitude. "Thank you for sharing this with me. I think maybe we're all struggling to correct our own mistakes somehow." From that moment on, something changed between the two women. Michelle began to participate more actively in therapy, always alongside Esther. During the sessions, Michelle would sit next to John, holding his hand and talking to him about happy memories, such as the trips they had taken together or the moments with Baxter. She seemed more open, more connected, as if she had finally found a way to make amends with herself and John. On one of their outings to the park, Michelle surprised Esther by suggesting that they take a portable radio. "Maybe music can help you again," said Michelle, with a slight smile. They chose a quiet spot, under the shade of a large tree, and put on a selection of classical music. Michelle, this time, sat down next to John and started talking about the music as if she were telling him a story. "Do you remember, John? This was your favorite. I used to play it in the car during our trips. You always turned it up and said it sounded like a movie. It was so typical of you." Michelle laughed softly, but her voice carried deep emotion. Esther watched from afar, feeling that she was witnessing something more powerful than any therapy, the reunion of two souls. Baxter, as always, was nearby, bringing his calm energy to the moment. He lay down next to John, occasionally glancing at Michelle as if approving of her efforts. The atmosphere was calm, but charged with meaning, as if the park was holding that moment in its essence. That day, when they returned to the mansion, Michelle seemed different. There was a light in her eyes that Esther hadn't seen before. During dinner, Michelle said something that surprised everyone at the table. "I was thinking, maybe we should turn one of the halls in the mansion into a therapy room, something more welcoming, closer to him." Mrs. Hilda smiled discreetly, while Esther nodded, feeling encouraged by Michelle's initiative. It was as if the experience in the park and John's small reactions had rekindled a hope she had buried. Over the next few days, Michelle and Esther continued to work together, strengthening not only John's therapies, but also the connection that had formed between them. Michelle, who had once been so distant, now seemed like a completely different woman, involved, open, and full of determination. Esther, for her part, felt that she was fulfilling her purpose in a more meaningful way than ever before. The transformation of the Blake mansion began almost imperceptibly. The walls, once filled with silence and despair, now seemed to resonate with echoes of hope. It was as if life was slowly returning to the house, pulled along by Esther's delicate but firm hands and the constant presence of Baxter, who never left John's side. Every little bit of progress the millionaire made was celebrated, with restrained but genuine joy, a reminder that perseverance and love could defy even the darkest adversity. The first major milestone was when John began to respond more frequently to sensory stimuli. One clear morning, as Michelle held his hand and described the flowers she had seen in the garden, Esther noticed a more pronounced movement in John's fingers. He squeezed Michelle's hand lightly, a gesture so subtle but at the same time so full of meaning that it made her tears overflow. "He heard me," Michelle whispered, looking at Esther with watery eyes. "I know he heard me." Esther, overcome with emotion, nodded. "I told you he's fighting to come back to us. It's a joint effort, Michelle. He feels the love around him." Baxter, as always, was present, lying at John's feet. The dog raised his head when he heard Michelle's emotional tone, and as if he understood the importance of the moment, gave a slight bark, wagging his tail. It was then that Esther realized that they were no longer alone on this journey. With every step, it seemed that John was pulling everyone towards a place of healing and unity. As progress became more evident, Michelle decided to take a bigger step. One afternoon, she called Esther to discuss hiring more specialized professionals. "If he's reacting so well, perhaps a physiotherapist could help him regain movement more quickly, and maybe other specialists too." His voice had a tone of determination that Esther hadn't heard before. "That's a wonderful idea, Michelle," Esther replied with a smile. "John is showing that he wants to come back to us. Let's give him every chance we can." Over the next week, the team grew. A physiotherapist was hired, bringing new equipment that transformed one of the halls of the mansion into a real rehabilitation clinic. Simple exercises, such as moving John's arms or stimulating his leg muscles, became part of the daily routine. Even in these more technical sessions, Baxter was always close by, sitting patiently or lying down next to John as if he wanted to participate in the effort. With each new reaction from John, the atmosphere in the mansion became lighter, more full of life. One day, during a physiotherapy session, Baxter started licking John's toes, something he had never done before. Michelle was sitting next to him, watching intently, when she noticed a tear slide down John's cheek. "He felt it, didn't he?" asked Michelle, her voice full of emotion. The physiotherapist smiled, confirming, "It seems so. Small stimuli like that can be crucial to his recovery." Michelle looked at Baxter gratefully, stroking the dog's head. "You always knew how to reach him, didn't you, kid?" Meanwhile, Esther continued to implement her holistic therapies, combining them with the advice of the doctors and specialists. Aromatherapy and music therapy remained an essential part of the sessions. One day, while soft music was playing in the background, John did something no one expected. His head moved slightly towards the sound. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but for Michelle and Esther, it was as if he had shouted that he was there, struggling to get back. With each advance, the connection between Michelle and Esther grew stronger. The two worked together tirelessly, sharing responsibilities as well as moments of celebration. There was laughter in the mansion again, something that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier. Even the doctors, initially skeptical, began to use the word that Michelle and Esther had longed to hear: miracle. During a routine visit, the neurologist following John's case observed his reactions and said with a discreet smile, "I can't explain exactly what's happening, but he's responding in a way that goes beyond what we expected. Keep up the good work. He's on the right track." These words brought indescribable relief to Michelle, who almost collapsed on hearing the positive diagnosis. Esther took her by the shoulders and gave her a warm smile. "He's showing us that he believes in us as much as we believe in him." The days went by, and with them came new small achievements. During a session in which the physiotherapist stimulated John's leg muscles, he was able to move his foot for the first time. Michelle, who was standing next to him, held Esther's hand tightly, tears rolling down her face. "He'll come back. I know he will." Esther, her eyes shining, replied, "Yes, he will. And we're not alone. He's fighting with us." Baxter seemed more vibrant than ever, as if he knew that his role in John's recovery was indispensable. The dog developed the habit of barking lightly next to John's bed, almost as if to encourage him to react. And every time John responded in some way, a tear, a slight movement, or a subtle change in his breathing, the Blake mansion, once a place of silence and sadness, was now full of life. The sound of voices, laughter, and even Baxter's bark echoed through the corridors. The staff, previously so reserved, also began to get more involved, helping to keep the atmosphere welcoming and positive. During a quiet evening, Michelle was sitting next to John, stroking his hand as they talked about the plans they had made before the accident. "You said you wanted to take Baxter to the mountains, remember? You said it would be our perfect trip, just the three of us. Promise me you'll come back so we can do it together, John." At that moment, as if Michelle's words had reached the depths of John's consciousness, his eyes flickered slightly, almost as if he was trying to open them. Michelle held her breath, looking at Esther, who was standing next to her. "Did you see that?" Michelle asked, her voice full of hope and excitement. "I saw it, Michelle," Esther replied, holding her hand. "He's telling us that he's close, very close to coming back to us." John still had a long way to go, but his constant struggle inspired everyone around him. And while Baxter remained faithful by his side, Michelle, Esther, and the team continued to work with a single goal in mind: to bring John back, not just to life, but to the home he loved so much. The Christmas spirit was beginning to take hold of the Blake mansion. Christmas lights shone on the facade, as if the house, once plunged into darkness and sadness, had decided to celebrate life again. The servants decorated the corridors with garlands and red ribbons, while Michelle took care of the last details of the meal. There was an atmosphere of togetherness in the air, a feeling that hadn't been felt for many months. John was still recovering, but his progress brought renewed hope, and everyone was determined to make that Christmas special. Esther was helping Michelle in the dining room, lovingly setting the table. Even though she was an employee, she was already part of the family. Her dedication to John had earned her the respect and gratitude of everyone, and Michelle made a point of inviting her to spend Christmas Eve there, alongside the people she now considered her family. Baxter, as always, ran around the house excitedly, wagging his tail and checking every corner, as if to make sure everything was perfect for the occasion. That evening, some of Michelle's close relatives arrived, bearing gifts and words of encouragement. Mrs. Hilda, the housekeeper, made sure everything was in order, while the guests chatted around the fireplace. Michelle, despite appearing calm, couldn't hide her anxiety. She knew that, even with all John's progress, the greatest gift she could receive would be to see him back, fully recovered. Esther, sensing her friend's concern, touched her shoulder gently. "Tonight is a special night, Michelle. Have faith. John has already shown us that he is capable of miracles." Michelle smiled, although a silent tear trickled from the corner of her eye. "You're right, Esther. He's already given us so much. Just the fact that he's here with us fighting is enough." When everyone gathered around the table, Michelle asked Esther to say the Christmas prayer. Esther, overcome with emotion, thanked them for the strength they had found over the last few months and for every little bit of progress John had made, asking him to continue to bless the family. After the prayer, the guests toasted, exchanging smiles and warm hugs. But everyone's attention soon turned to John's room where he lay. Michelle asked Esther to accompany her there. They entered the room with Baxter close behind, as if he knew something important was about to happen. Michelle approached John, holding his hand gently. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered, as a silent tear fell from her eye. Esther felt a shiver run through her body. There was something about the atmosphere that seemed different, as if an invisible force was about to manifest itself. Suddenly, John made a slight movement with his head, and his eyelids, which had been immobile for so many months, began to tremble. Michelle held her breath, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. "John?" she called, her voice breaking. And then it happened. Slowly, John's eyes opened, revealing a glow that everyone thought they would never see again. He looked around, confused but present, and whispered with difficulty but with a clarity that left everyone speechless. "Michelle." "Baxter." Michelle fell to her knees beside the bed, sobbing with emotion. "My God, John, you're back. You're here." She held his face in her hands, kissing his forehead repeatedly as tears streamed down her face. Baxter, realizing what had happened, started barking excitedly and ran out of the room, climbing onto John's bed and licking his face as if to express all the joy he felt. He then ran down the corridors of the mansion, running from one side to the other, as if announcing to everyone that the miracle had happened. When the guests heard Baxter's frantic barking, they rushed into the room, finding Michelle, Esther, and John in a moment of pure emotion. "He's opened his eyes," Michelle announced, her voice broken by sobs. "He's spoken my names and Baxter's." Everyone around began to cry and applaud, unable to contain their happiness. Esther was hugged by Michelle, who repeated through her tears, "Thank you, Esther. Thank you for never giving up. You made it happen." John, still weak, watched everything with tears in his eyes. He couldn't say much, but his eyes conveyed gratitude and love. When he saw Michelle by his side and Baxter lying on his feet, he cried silently, feeling blessed to have the people he loved so much by his side and who had never given up on him. Over the next few days, John surprised even more. His progress was rapid and impressive. He began to speak more clearly, could move his hands, and with the help of the physiotherapist, even took his first steps. The doctors were amazed, calling his recovery something without scientific explanation. For Michelle, Esther, and everyone at the mansion, there was no doubt. It was a true miracle. Over time, John began to regain parts of his old life. He would spend hours in the garden with Michelle and Baxter, enjoying the sunshine and the company of those who had been by his side throughout the process. Every day was a celebration of life, and the mansion, once silent, was now full of laughter, conversation, and the sounds of a new routine. Inspired by everything they had experienced, Michelle made a decision that changed their lives even more. Over breakfast with Esther, she announced, "I want to open a recovery center here on the property, something inspired by everything you did for John. I want to help other families who are going through what we went through." Esther was thrilled. "That would be incredible, Michelle. There's nothing more rewarding than offering hope to those who feel that all is lost." A few months later, the center opened. With Esther at the helm, using the techniques she had developed, and John as a living example of overcoming, the space became a symbol of hope and healing. Michelle devoted her energy to ensuring that the center had the best professionals and resources, while John visited whenever he could to encourage the patients. In that same room where John had spent so many months in silence, there was now music, conversation, and stories of overcoming. Baxter, of course, was the official mascot, always present, bringing joy to all who were there. The Blake mansion, once a symbol of sadness, became a beacon of hope for so many people. And that Christmas, looking up at the starry sky, Michelle, Esther, and John knew that they had found the greatest miracle of all, the love that united their lives forever. Did you like this moving story? Which city are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to know. I wish you a Merry Christmas, full of love, hope, and unforgettable moments. And take the opportunity to watch the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. I'm sure you'll love it.